I was 38 years old the day I found out my parents had already picked out curtains for a house I hadn't told them I was buying. Not curtains for a house they owned. Curtains for mine. Here's the thing about being a forensic accountant. You stop believing what people say and you start believing what the paper trail says. And the paper trail on my family had been sitting in a folder in my office for 11 months before I understood what I was looking at. Welcome back to Wise Dad Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. My name is Elena. I trace money for a living. Insurance fraud, embezzlement, the occasional divorce where somebody thinks a shell company in Delaware is going to hide a boat. I've spent 14 years learning that people lie with their mouths and tell the truth with their spreadsheets. I did not expect to need that skill on my own family. I was wrong about that, the way I am wrong about very little else in my professional life. My husband, Daniel, is the reason the house even entered the conversation. We'd been married 6 years, married the way too tired. Careful people get married quietly in a backyard with a cake his aunt made and my toast written on an index card because I don't trust myself with a microphone and no script. He teaches high school physics. He believes, with the stubbornness of a man who has never once been audited, that most problems can be solved if you just write them down clearly enough. I married him because he was the first person in my life who didn't need me to fix anything. Before Daniel, there was my grandmother, Ruth. Ruth raised me summers and most weekdays because my parents were building something, a business, a reputation, a life that required a great deal of admiration and very little supervision of their children. My brother Marcus got the admiration. I got Ruth's kitchen table, her ledger books from the dry cleaning business she'd run for 30 years, and her conviction that a woman should always know exactly how much money she has and exactly who owes her what. She used to say, while teaching me to reconcile her checkbook at age 11, "Debt isn't always money, Elena. Sometimes it's a favor somebody keeps handing you the bill for." I didn't understand that sentence until I was 38. My family ran on an arithmetic I didn't fully see until it was too late to unsee it. Marcus was the golden variable, the one whose failures were reframed as setbacks and whose successes were framed as inevitabilities. I was the constant. The one who flew home for every hospital scare. The one who paid off my father's roof when the insurance claim got denied, and never once heard the words "thank you," because in my family, gratitude was something you extended to people who might stop giving. I never stopped. So I never got it. That was the ledger nobody wrote down, but everyone kept. On the 14th of March, I put an offer on a house on Birchwood Lane. 100-year-old craftsman with a wraparound porch and a greenhouse in the back that hadn't held a living plant in a decade. I didn't tell my parents I was looking. I didn't tell them when the offer was accepted. I told them 3 weeks later, over dinner, the way you'd mention any other piece of good, unremarkable news. My mother put her fork down first. Then she said, "You bought a house. On Birchwood." Without telling us. I said I didn't realize telling them was a requirement for buying real estate. My father didn't say anything. He looked at my mother the way you look at someone when a plan you built together has just been run over in the driveway. It was my mother who finally said it, 3 days later, over the phone, her voice doing the thing it does when she's decided to be wounded instead of honest. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" That house was supposed to be Marcus's. I asked her what she meant by supposed to be. She said, "We had it handled." I am a woman who documents things for a living, so I did what I do. I opened a note on my phone, right there on the call, and I wrote down the date, the time, and the 4 words, "We had it handled." I didn't know yet what they'd handled, or how, or with whose money. But 11 years of forensic work have taught me that when someone says a plan was interrupted, there is always a document somewhere that describes the plan. I just had to find it. I found it in my grandmother's things. Ruth passed in January, 14 months before any of this started, and I was named executor of her estate, a fact that surprised exactly no one, since I was the only grandchild who'd ever sat with her ledgers and understood what they meant. Settling an estate is slow, deliberate work, and I'd been moving through it at the unhurried pace grief allows you when nobody's rushing you. In April, going through a locked file box Ruth kept in her closet, the kind of box that holds the paperwork people don't want found by accident, I found the trust. Not the small one everyone knew about, the one that had already been distributed. A second trust. Established 9 years earlier. Funded quietly in increments from the sale of Ruth's dry cleaning business and a life insurance policy she'd never mentioned to a living soul. The trust named a single beneficiary. Me. Not my grandchildren. Not my estate to be divided equally. Me by name, with a letter clipped to the front of the document in her handwriting, dated the same day she'd signed it. I sat with that letter longer than I've sat with any piece of evidence in my professional life. It said, in part, that she'd watched what my parents did with fairness, how they weighed it, measured it, and always found a way to tip the scale toward the child who required tipping. She wrote that she wasn't leaving me more because she loved me more. She was leaving me what I'd already paid for in years, in patience, in showing up. She called it, in her own words, a debt finally settled, not a gift given. I read that sentence 3 times before I could make myself keep going. The second document was smaller and worse, in the particular way small things are worse. A letter from my mother to Ruth's attorney, dated 7 months before Ruth's death, asking, in the calm, reasonable tone people use when they're asking for something indefensible, whether the trust could be restructured to better reflect the needs of the whole family. Given that Marcus was, in her words, at a stage where a home would change his trajectory. The attorney's file included his written reply. He declined. Ruth, he noted, had been unambiguous and of sound mind on the matter, twice, in writing. My parents had tried to take my inheritance and redirect it to my brother a full 7 months before my grandmother died. And when the attorney told them no, they didn't tell me any of this happened. They just waited. They waited for the money to become mine, and then they waited for me to be generous with it in the direction they'd already planned, because generosity had always been the tax I paid for being loved in that house. They hadn't expected me to buy a house with it first. I didn't call anyone. I made a copy of both documents, put the originals back exactly where Ruth had left them, and drove home. Daniel found me at the kitchen table an hour later, still in my coat, the letter from the attorney flat in front of me like it might say something different if I waited long enough. The pressure started the following week, before anyone in my family knew what I'd found. My mother called to say the family was getting together for Marcus's birthday, and wouldn't it be a nice gesture, given everything, if I mentioned to him that the Birchwood house had more room than 2 people needed. My father, on a separate call, floated the idea that I could let Marcus buy in as a co-owner, keep it in the family, financially speaking. Nobody used the word inheritance. Nobody used the word trust. They talked around the money the way you talk around a body you don't want to admit is in the room. Marcus came to see me directly on a Tuesday. He stood in my kitchen, in the house he believed was supposed to be his, and told me that our parents had basically promised him a place like this for years, that I'd always landed on my feet, and he hadn't. And that family was supposed to mean something. He said, "You don't even need this house the way I do." I asked him one question. I asked him what, specifically, our parents had promised him, and when. He didn't have a date. He didn't have a document. He had a feeling that had been fed to him his whole life and never once put in writing, because the people feeding it had never intended to put it in writing where I might find it. He left without an answer, because I hadn't given him one to leave with. That night, I called my attorney. I told her to send the letter's formal notice to the family, that the second trust existed, that I was its sole and named beneficiary, and that any further contact regarding restructuring or family arrangements concerning that trust would go through her office. Mid-story CTA. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon for you suddenly find all the time in the world the moment money enters the room, you already know exactly where this story goes. Stay with me. The letters landed like a verdict nobody had seen coming, because nobody in my family had ever imagined I'd fight back with paperwork instead of feelings. My mother called it vindictive. My father called it unnecessary. Neither of them called it what it was, which was the only language they'd ever actually respected: proof. They invited me to Sunday dinner 2 weeks later. I understood the invitation for what it was: a gathering built to pressure me into surrendering something gracefully before it had to be taken from me publicly. I accepted. I brought a folder. The dinner started the way these dinners always start in my family: warm, performative, my mother's good dishes out, a toast from my father about family sticking together through anything. Marcus raised his glass and said, with the easy confidence of a man who'd already decided how the evening would end, to Elena, for finally doing the right thing. He said it like a verdict already delivered. Like all that was left was for me to nod along and hand over the keys. I asked for the floor. They gave it to me because they thought I was about to give in. I opened the folder and set the first document on the table. The trust with Ruth's signature and the date. I said her name, and I said what the document said, in the flat, exact language I use when I present findings to a client who does not want to hear them. Then I set down the second document, the letter my mother had written to the attorney, asking to have the trust restructured. I read the date aloud. I read the phrase at the stage where a home would change his trajectory aloud. My mother's face did something I had never once seen it do in 38 years. It went still. My father tried first, soft, reasonable. We only wanted what was fair for everyone. Then my mother, sharper, accusing me of turning a family matter into a legal one, as if I were the one who'd written a letter behind someone's back 7 months before they died. Then Marcus, loud now, saying I'd always thought I was better than everyone, that I was punishing him for something that wasn't his fault. I let each wave land and pass. I answered each one quieter than the last, because I had learned, a long time ago, in rooms far more hostile than my mother's dining room, that volume is what people reach for when they've run out of facts. Then it went silent, the way rooms go silent when everyone has finally understood there's nothing left to say that the paper hasn't already said better. I set the third and final item on the table. Ruth's letter, not the legal one, the personal one, the one clipped to the front of the trust in her own handwriting. I read them one line, the one she'd underlined herself. This isn't a gift, Elena. It's a debt finally settled. I let that sentence sit on the table between the good china for a long moment before I said anything else. It was my Aunt Diane's sister, my quiet Aunt Carol, who'd sat through the whole dinner saying almost nothing, who finally spoke. She looked at my mother and said, "You tried to take it before she even knew it was hers." Nobody answered her. Nobody thanked her for saying it, either, but she'd said it, out loud, in a room that needed to hear it from someone who wasn't me. I stood up and, before I left, I said one sentence, because a verdict doesn't need a speech to go with it. You spent 30 years teaching me what family owes each other. I finally learned to read the invoice. Then I picked up my folder and I left the good china exactly where it was. Here's how the rest of it settled. The house on Birchwood is mine, paid in full from the trust Ruth built for exactly this purpose, with a mortgage balance of $0 and a deed that has one name on it. My parents did not attend the closing, and I did not invite them. Marcus bought a condo 11 months later, on his own financing, under his own name, the first major purchase of his adult life that didn't have my parents' hands somewhere on the paperwork. I don't know if it changed anything in him. I know it's his, at least, in the way nothing before it ever fully was. My mother called 4 months after the dinner. Not to apologize, my family doesn't really traffic in apologies, only in de-escalations disguised as peace offerings, but to ask whether I'd let it go by now. I told her I had let it go. I told her the letters had already gone. That was the last conversation of substance we've had. My father sends a card at Christmas. I send one back. We are, at this point, people who share a bloodline and very little else, and I've stopped pretending that's a tragedy instead of just a fact. The letter from Ruth doesn't live in a file box anymore. It's framed in the greenhouse behind the Birchwood house, which I rebuilt the summer after I moved in. New glass, new soil, new benches, the first thing in that house that was entirely, deliberately mine before anything else was. I grow tomatoes there now, the same variety Ruth grew behind the dry cleaners. In soil I turn myself on Sunday mornings. In the 1 hour of the week I don't spend thinking about anyone's ledger but my own. I don't call what I did revenge, and I'd ask you not to either. Revenge is something you go looking for. What I did was simpler than that. I stopped paying a bill nobody had ever shown me, for a debt I never once agreed to owe. My grandmother didn't leave me money to punish my family. She left it to me because she'd watched, for 30 years, exactly who showed up and exactly who was counted on to keep showing up regardless, and she decided, quietly, in a lawyer's office nobody else knew about, that the ledger was finally going to balance in my favor. Some inheritances are money. Ours was information. She just made sure I'd know how to read it when it mattered. Final CTA. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts and that boundaries are allowed even with your own blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.